Hey, I think we're live. Let's see. Let me adjust my crooked camera there. There we go. Hello. Can anybody hear me? Hey, I think we're live. Hey, let's see. Let me turn off my speakers. They could hear me. I know we're live now. Okay. So it's going to have weird feedback there for just a second, but I turned my speakers off, so I think that'll be fixed. We'll give everybody a few minutes to get in here, so I'm going to readjust just a little bit. Just got back from a great little local Mexican restaurant for Cinco de Mayo, so got some nice beads. And got the Hulk Buster here, which is what I'll be doing my little demo on. We got what time is it? 8:01. Hey, I did pretty good. I'm getting back. I didn't think I was gonna get back in time. Make sure my phone's silent here. All right. Well, do we have you do it, Ben? All right. It's like 5 on here now. All right. Well, I've got a new method that I've been working on, a new technique for doing some of these really fine detail pieces. And actually, this is kind of the reason that I started doing it, is that this print, this 300 hours of printing was painstaking. There was tons of support. The model's beautiful, but it was cut up in just such a way that there was still just a ton of support no matter how you oriented it. Tons of little crevices, and that's the hardest thing to do on finishing. Hi, Dan. Yeah, it was over 300 hours because there was also failures in there too, and I did not count that in the time. But I know you guys have seen this, but if you look carefully, there are just tons and tons of little crevices everywhere. And that just makes it so hard to finish. Something easy would be more like Captain America. Captain America is mostly smooth. Let's see if that'll show up on the camera here. It's mostly smooth, so that really isn't that difficult to do the finishing work on. It's really easy to sand smooth when you've got big surfaces, big flat surfaces, curves, things of that nature. But this, there's not a lot of big flat surfaces. For as large as the model is, it's just tiny little crevices and undercuts everywhere. So I started playing around with new techniques. And one of the things that I use a lot of is this glazing putty, Bondo brand glazing putty. They call it a spot putty. And that's what it looks like in the package here. I don't know if it'll focus for us, but that's what it is. And I use the crap out of it. It just works really well. But there again, when you go to put it into one of these little crevices, you still have to be able to sand it and take most of it off. So I started thinking about what can I do to apply this in these little crevices and undercuts without having to do a whole lot of sanding afterwards. So that's when I came up with this little, I call it soft sanding because I have no better word for it or name for it. And I apply it with a brush. And the key is to use something that's a fairly stiff brush, but not, not super stiff. It's still fairly soft on the tip. You can see I've actually used this one multiple times. So it doesn't ruin the brush, but I'll show you how I do that. So let me find you a good little part here where there's some undercuts, and let's see if I'm going to pull up my other screen here so I can see in more real time what I'm trying to show you. Okay. This will be an exercise in frustration, I'm sure, in trying to show you some of the things that I am, but if I can get it to focus. Here's a prime example of these little areas where even the filler primer is just not enough. So I will point to it using the brush. So this one specifically, you can see it down in there where it's kind of pointing with my brush. It's just a rough surface, and there's really nothing you can do. You know, you can't really get sandpaper down in there. I've made do at times with tools like this, which is a small little cordless engraving tool. It's actually got a little bit on here, and I can get to some things with that, but some parts you just can't. So that's where I came up with this. And I apologize, I'm going to jump back and forth between a couple of screens here so I can see what you guys are saying and be able to see what I'm doing in real time too. Okay, so I'm going to set this down for a second and open up my Blazing Putty, and I'll show you exactly how I'm applying this. And there's a little bit of technique to it, but it's really not difficult. So I'm pretty excited because I like when things are easy, and when it's easy for everybody else to do. There's not a whole lot of skill involved. So I take a little glob, just a little glob, not a huge amount. And gosh, this guy is big and heavy, so this will be fun. Okay. If I can get her to focus again. Maybe. Really is pretty heavy at this point. All right, what I'm going to do is I am literally just going to mush it in there and paint it in there. And it's going to fill in the majority of that. And just blend it off anywhere that you can, because you want as little to have to sand afterwards as possible. And this is why I call it soft sanding, because as I do this, if you go against the grain, you will almost inevitably eliminate the sanding that's needed in the crevice itself when you're done. So now that I've put some in there, let me see if I can get her to focus again. Okay. It may take a couple of coats, but you can already see that a lot of that is filled in. And let me know if you guys are able to see that, or if I need to try something else for focusing. But as far as I can tell, it's showing up. And you can just make out a little bit of that roughness, but most of it is gone at this point, at least in that little spot I was talking about. Let me know if you guys are able to see that, if you're still able to hear me okay. And I'm going to look for another spot so I can show it again. There's plenty of spots on here, so no shortage of them. Let me find one that I think I might be able to focus on pretty well. That's the trick, because these are crevices. It's hard not only to sand them, but to get the camera to focus on it pretty well. Actually, this will be a good example here, because you don't have to use it in crevices, but every once in a while you get some just rough surfaces that you need, like maybe where you had a lot of support attached to it and it's really rough, which is actually what I did on the bottom here. But there's some surfaces here. This is in white, so I'm not sure if it's going to focus. Yeah, you can see the roughness here and even right here. And I'm just going to use this as an example because I can get it to focus. And I did a lot of this before assembly, but the way that the parts printed, there was just so much that you still couldn't get to. Even when the parts were separate, there's just so much undercuts and overhangs and support material needed. I do try to do most of my smoothing before I assemble something, but this one, it was just ridiculous. I did a lot of it before I put each part together, but it's still, it was still a nightmare. So I'm going to show you just on these couple little parts because I can get it to focus there. But imagine these as really deep crevices because there's plenty of them that are like this. So grab my brush again. And this stuff does get really, really firm. So every time I go to use my brush, I will soften it back up, basically crumble all of this putty that's hardened on it. Just do that and it softens right back up. So I'll take a little bit more, another little glob. And I'm just going to literally paint it on here. And this just gets it deep into those grooves and craters. And the key to this stuff is to put it on in small layers. And this really helps you do that. As long as you glob it in there and then just brush it afterwards, you're going to take most of it back off, which is what you want. You want it to get into the crevices and to take most of it off the top. So you let that dry, which if you get it on thin, it's going to go really quick. It's going to dry really fast. And then you can go back and do it again. And what I try to do is I just did that little spot. I'm going to find another little spot I can move to while that one's drying. So this is another spot that would be fairly hard to sand back in here. I don't know if you can tell, there's a difference here in about an inch between this surface and this surface. That makes this one, which is settled between these two, really pretty difficult to sand. So if I glob this in here, and this is the bottom of the foot, so nobody's really going to see it anyways, but I always still try to finish every single bit of something, even if I know it's not really going to be seen. That's just me. So I brush it on. I'm going to go into this little crevice of a corner here because I want that nice and smooth for when I go to paint things. And that's really about all there is to it. You just keep going back over these little rough spots until it's pretty much smooth. And you just keep going over with the same brush. You don't have to really worry about using too much sandpaper until the very end if you want to do that. A lot of times weathering, when you go to do the weathering after you've got everything painted, you kind of want the little crevices to have some roughness to it so that it holds on to what you're weathering with. It's just a nice part of the weathering technique. Be able to have it grab on to that dirt. So let's see, while those two spots are drying, I'm going to rotate them around and show you one where it's right in here. You can kind of see if I dab in here, you can see this is just a really rough spot. It was a weird undercut, and the print angles, because of all the other ones, this one had to be sacrificed because it wasn't going to be seen that well, but it made it really, really rough. It really doesn't matter if you do this before or after primer. Just remember that if you put glazing putty on fresh primer, and by fresh I mean within a few hours, glazing putty will start to remove the primer. Primer has to cure before you can put glazing putty on it. So if you're going to put glazing putty over primer, give it at least several hours, if not a day, before you put that on. If you're going to put it on a raw print, you don't have to do any waiting because there's no primer there to take off. And this primer here is a 2-in-1 filler primer that is sandable. Softening that up again. That just helps having a nice brush tip for when you apply it. So I'm going to take another glob, and I'm going to go into that really rough spot. That was my sacrificed spot. And literally I'm just glob it in there, brush it around as much as you can. And it's amazing how well this works. I was shocked. I mean, I've used glazing putty a lot in the past, but I've never really applied it with a brush. But it works. As long as you go across the grain, not with the grain. If you go with the grain, you're going to pull it right out of the grain, and then it's not really helping you a whole lot. So if you're going across the grain, like I am here, it's going to deposit into the grain, into the little divots and stuff. And like I said, this is a multi-step process, and just then you want to do a lot of layers. Everything with the painting and the finishing work and sanding, it's all about layers. I got another glob here. I can even do it on something like this. This is like a little bubbly shape here. It's just like a part of a circle, and it's got some rings, concentric rings and stuff around here. You can even just take this and do the same method and use that brush, almost paint it over that whole surface that is not easy to sand initially. So you do this, and when you're done, if you want to sand it, it's going to sand super easy. It's not going to take a lot of work. Really deep crevices and stuff, you probably just are going to leave them. And that's usually what I would do, is just leave it, and it's going to help when you go to weather it anyways. And you can still filler primer over this. It works really well with that. So if you get most of the bad sections taken care of with this stuff, when you go to put the filler primer over this, it's going to be pretty much smooth anyways. Does anybody have any questions? And I've been trying to answer questions as we go. So if you have any more questions or want to see any different bits of this done, whatever you want, I can do that real quick. Thank you. I'll show you some of the, just while I'm waiting for you guys, if you want to answer. I've got, this is emery cloth. This is one of the main sanding tools that I use. Instead of actual sandpaper, I use emery cloth because it's a lot more flexible without getting that crinkle to it. That stuff works fantastic. Little files. I do use a lot of little files. The main file I use is one of these nail files that's got a rough side and a smoother side. And these are fantastic because you can actually clean them out more than anything. So between this and the emery cloth, it takes care of most of what I do. But then I also have a lot of little files if I want to get really specific parts. Usually if there's like a slot or something that I need to smooth out, like a flat spot within a slot, I'll switch over to a file. Or I'll go back to the, dental picks are great. I actually need to get a set for my finishing tools. But just a little engraving tool, or because it's battery powered, so it's not super fast. I don't know if you can hear that. It's not super fast and it's not super strong, so it's very forgiving when you use it, and it's got just that little tiny rough ball on the end, a little metal rough ball. And I use that a lot for as much as I can when it comes to these little crevices and things. It'll take off the big stuff. And that's a tool you want to use smoothly, I guess would be the term. You don't want it to sit in one spot and grind away. You want to keep it moving if you can. If you sit in one spot, it'll end up taking it and putting a divot where you don't want it. But if you go pretty quick, it knocks off the larger bits. In fact, I use this a lot if I'm trying to take care of a crevice. As long as it reaches, I'll even paint in some of this glazing putty, and it takes off the glazing putty really fast. All right, so let me know what you think of the new technique. What are they called? The soft sanding. What layer height did I use on the Hulkbuster? Hulkbuster, I did almost everything in 0.15. And he's mostly PETG, but I think I might have had one or two little pieces in there that was PLA. I think I did mostly PETG on that one. Yeah, that's all 0.15. On some of the other parts, I've started doing some PLA that's in 0.1, which has been turning out really well. If you can see on Captain America, his leg, there's not really any layer lines there. That was actually done in PETG at 0.15. So that just shows you that PETG can actually be really, really smooth, just like PLA. This is a texture on here. That's in the model. That's not anything from the printing. That's actually in the model. There's very few layer lines showing up on that. Get it. I think PETG is actually easier to finish. You can print PLA at a higher resolution, which eliminates more of your finishing. But as far as the actual finishing work itself, PETG is easier because it's a slightly softer material, and that allows you to sand it a little bit more. PLA being a harder material, it's actually harder to sand. So it depends if you can get your PETG dialed in at, say, a 0.15 millimeter layer height, then it's definitely worth doing it in PETG. If you're struggling to print with PETG and you're very good with PLA, as far as printing it nice and smooth, print in PLA. And if you print it nice and smooth, it's not going to take a whole lot of finishing work anyways. So the extra amount of effort in sanding is going to be eliminated by that. Now, if you live in a hot climate, you probably are not going to want to print in PLA anyways if you end up taking things in your car and you get that hot car effect. So all right, I'll do another little detail here. I know I'm not going to be able to get this one to focus, but inside this little hole right here, I can see some layer lines. So I'm going to take some of this. And this is where this technique really shines, is I can work this brush in here. maybe brighten this up. We got tons of lights over here. Here we go. I can work this putty in here with the brush. Kind of clean up the excess as I go. Just cleaning off the brush a little bit so I can smooth this out. So I've painted it into that little hole, and there was a whole bunch of layer lines on the walls inside of there, but I just smashed the putty in there and moved the brush around enough that it's really into those grooves, and it's eliminated most of what sanding would be necessary in there. And I can do that a couple of times. Like I said, you want to do some layers in here. So that's where this technique really shines, is stuff like that. It's really hard to reach. There's no way you're going to get, even if you get the sandpaper in there, there's no way you're going to get any force on it to be able to sand that. You could use files, but files, it's going to take a lot of work, especially with the way these layer lines are oriented. I got more light here. There we go. So I can actually do the other one real quick. I'm going to do this where I can see it too. So another one here. Mush it in there. Wiggle it around. And blend it off so you don't have any clumps hanging on anywhere. Clean off the brush. When I clean off the brush, I usually do it on something that's fairly rough. And I can show you what I'm using here. Yeah, I tried to do as much of that detail cleanup before assembly as I can, but some of this stuff is just impossible, no matter if you do it before or after assembly. Like that piece I was just doing here, it's part of the big piece that's all printed at once, this whole section. So regardless, I mean, there's not really any benefit to doing this little piece here before or after. But I did do like the arms and the body and all these other pieces. I did a lot of finishing work on them before I even put it together. But even afterwards, there was still lots of little stuff that I missed, like inside of these. This just, hundreds of little undercuts everywhere. But yeah, do as much as you can before assembly as possible. Sometimes it's just not possible, or the piece, each individual piece has a lot of these weird little spots that you're going to have to do. That's where I use this techniques mostly. So I'll show you real quick what I am using. This is a piece of rubber mat that is like a chemically resistant mat, and I use that for a lot of stuff. But if you look, I'm just rubbing the brush on it, and that pulls a lot of this off of here so that it softens the brush back up. The brush is nice and soft now. So when I go to use it again, I'll still do this again after it's dried for a while, and the brush will be fine for the next application. So I don't have to throw away brushes just because I use glazing putty off them. And I have no idea where to get this mat. I have a bunch of it. You can see over there too. I have a few other little rolls of it. I get it free from work because we have it for specific purposes, and it ends up as like a throwaway item. But I don't know where you would go and purchase it, but that's that's what I've been using here, and it's great stuff. So I don't know if anybody ever finds what the link might be to some of that. Throw it in the comments. I'll look for a link for it too. All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, I think we're pretty much at a good stopping point. I'll give it another minute here for the lag. While I'm waiting, I'll throw out a little high five to Joel. I wore your favorite shirt. I am printing all those ground pieces. So what Ben's talking about is there's base parts that go with all of these giant figures. And yes, I am printing all of the base pieces that go to make the whole scene come together. The position of his hand up here meshes with the Hulk, and the Hulk is standing on a base piece, and he'll be standing on a big base piece. And you can see there's holes in the feet where the base piece actually has little pegs that come up, and it fits into that. Yeah, there's broken up ground pieces and walls. There's even like a little fire hydrant that's half knocked over and all sorts of stuff. Did I do Thor or just Strange? Well, I've done Doctor Strange, and I am currently starting on Thor. I just finished up the Captain America that I showed a little bit ago. There's also, I don't know if you can see him in the back there, is Spider-Man back there. But yeah, there's quite a few pieces to all that scene. Let's see. Oh, I think they all fit on the same one. The very last picture on that guy's files had all the characters, Thor, Doctor Strange, Hulk, Hulkbuster, Spider-Man, Captain America, all in the scene together. I think there was like one picture that had them all in there. And actually, Doctor Strange stands up by himself. He doesn't even have a peg, but they showed it sitting on the platform with everything else. All right, guys, I think that's probably about it. It's a real simple technique. Like I said, just get a decent little brush, something fairly flat on the bristles here. If you looked, it was fairly flat coming across. You don't really want anything pointed just because that's going to get into the grooves more. You want something that's going to go across them. Remember to put on just a little glob, brush across the grain, and keep your layers of it pretty thin so it'll dry really quick. That's really about all there is to it. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for watching. If you liked it, like, subscribe, ring the bell, and hopefully I'll do some more of these videos later. I'll show you all the new techniques I come up with. I'm actually working on another one for some masking techniques. That'll be really cool. So we'll see how that turns out. That one's an experiment that's going on right now that I'm using on Spider-Man. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, everybody. I love getting feedback. If you guys have techniques you want to share with me, shoot me a message, leave a comment. I'd love to see what you guys are doing. If you have any more questions, don't hesitate. go ahead and ask, and I'll answer as best I can. Until next time, thank you. I'm Andrew with Bad Wolf Props.